my name's Gretchen Pitt, and as you've just heard, I've been working in Agile software teams for around 10 years now in various roles. So I've been a software tester as well as a business analyst and also product owner. And during that time, I've attended lots of retros, but I've also facilitated quite a few retros for my own teams and also for other teams within my company that I work for. Now, during that time, I found there are three main problems with running retros. So the first problem is lack of actions, which means lack of learnings. So the idea of a retro is that you try to find out what you can actually improve on and work on something for the next iteration or sprint. If you don't have any actions, it indicates that you're not actually getting any learnings, you're not actually actively looking at what you can actually improve on. The second problem is boredom or monotony. So if you have the same retro format sprint after sprint, you get a bit bored with it, you get a bit complacent, and you're just not getting the most out of the retro. And the third problem is participation. So if it's in a format that people don't feel safe or they don't feel they can actually contribute, you're losing out because every part of the team is integral to the team. And if you're not hearing somebody's opinion, you're really missing out. So my promise to you in the next 20 or 30 minutes, I'll take you through how you can identify when a retro is going bad and how you can move forward to actually effectively get your team to work together and contribute and learn more from retros. So it's in three parts. Some of these parts will be quite small, but when retros go bad, how we can get better retros, and also a retro for every occasion, so a bit of a toolkit. So first one, when retros go bad. So I'm going to go into a bit of a story here. So imagine this, it's a Friday afternoon, it's the end of the sprint, and it's a nice day outside, and we're kind of relaxed as a team as we come into the room. We're actually holding the retro in the boardroom, so it's a big long table, we've got a window on the side, and as we come in, people are talking, laughing, being really casual, great. But then we get to the point of, okay, well, who's running the retro today? Because we don't actually have a dedicated Scrum Master or iteration manager, but we take it in turns as a team. But unfortunately, normally the way we run it is that somebody's nominated at the beginning of the sprint, but we forgot who was actually nominated at the beginning of the sprint. So we're left with, okay, well, who's going to run it? And somebody steps up who's, he's actually the CIO of the company, but it's a really small startup, so he's part of the team. And he decides, yep, I'll run the retro. Great, okay, let's do this. What he went into though, instead of a regular retro format, he decided, well, let's have a look at how the team is actually running as individuals. And instead of becoming a bit more of a discussion and people contributing, it was more of him talking and telling us how he saw things, how he saw individuals in the team working. And then he started on some behaviours that actually were attributed to myself. Now, he didn't actually say my name, didn't point me out, but the way he was talking, it was kind of obvious that he was talking about me. And this was about stuff that I thought been resolved ages ago. And so I just felt like, yeah, this is not the right time to bring this up. And I was feeling very uncomfortable. And with my personality, I sort of just shut down. I just did not want to participate in it. It just felt more like he was telling us how we should be working rather than how we can actually work together collaboratively. So that retro did not go well at all. And in the end, I just, as I mentioned, I did not actually contribute at that point. And it just felt like it brought the mood down. We didn't actually get any actions from it. It was just more of a talk fest. And that was a really good example of a bad retro. Because what happened was, instead of being able to have everyone contribute in a safe environment, it became an environment that felt unsafe. So what can we do when we're actually in a retro like that? So first off, we can try and recognise when things go wrong. So the first thing that went wrong with that retro, we didn't have anyone dedicated to facilitate that retro. So there was no planning, no one was prepped to go in and say, okay, well, let's look at this sprint and see what we can do from here. And it was also a case of people being a bit lackadaisical. They came in just expecting somebody to fill the role of facilitator. They knew they kind of had to participate, but weren't really willing to participate at the same time. So it's being able to just say to yourself, okay, well, if there's no one stepping up, let me step up, which I should have really done, but I didn't at the time. And what you can do is actually have a bit of a toolkit, so a retro toolkit where you can actually pull out a card or something similar that has a retro format on it that you can then run. So in the case of, last minute preps. But ideally, the facilitator should be prepped beforehand and be able to come in with a format. Another thing you can recognise when things are going to go wrong is when you're seeing people not contributing. And that could be for various reasons. But one of the formats that can be used is when people just can vocalise what issues or achievements happen in the sprint. Sometimes vocalising is not the right format, and I often find that with different personality types, introvert, as an introvert, I don't really like vocalising too much unless I'm really solid with what I want to say. However, if I had something to think about and then write down, it makes it a lot easier for me to then speak about what I've actually written. So having post-its is an awesome way of actually being able to get information from people in a non-threatening way. And the next step is, once you've recognised that things aren't going quite to plan, is to try and adjust where you are going with that retro. Now, this is a little tricky. Takes a bit of confidence to step up and say this, but you can step up and say, okay, this discussion is great, but we really need to get to the actions or learnings that we want to get from this retro. And that's then suggesting another way of actually running the retro rather than just a all-in discussion where not everyone's going to be discussing because that's just the way of things. So those are some of the signs of when a retro goes bad. So how can we get better at retros? So why would you want to have a good retro? Well, first one is you do want the team to learn. And that's the point of the retro, is to be able to have the team learning how they're working together and how they can work better together. We also want to be able to have the ability to improve things, and that's part of the learning as well. And why you would also want to have better retros is you don't want to be a time waster. This is taking out a chunk of time in people's day, and you want to have the most effective use of that time. And you don't want people to be in there just because they have to be in there. They really should be in there because they want to help and contribute to the team. So what is a retrospective? So some of you come from an Agile background, some of you don't. And the idea of a retro within Agile is part of the inspect and adapt principle. So we're actually getting together to review what the previous piece of work was, to celebrate any achievements that happened in that period of time, but also to learn from what went wrong, or to actually try to improve on the achievements we have had and see, okay, what can we do to actually improve that even better, make it even better. Retros can go from anywhere between 1 hour to half a day, depending on the time frame that you're looking at. So it's not just for an iteration or a sprint, which can be anywhere between 1 week to 4 weeks, depending on the team you're working in. But it could also be to encompass a project or a release. So it's always good to actually have a retrospective, for example, at the end of a release. Even if it's a really big team, because you may have different teams involved, but there's always learnings that you can get and things that you can actually apply. And so it's always good to actually have that time of reflection and being able to acknowledge, okay, yep, we did this great, but we stuffed this up. How can we improve that for next time? So how can we go about running a retro that is actually really effective? So the first step with that one is to make sure that you have somebody that's going to be facilitating that retro. Now, that can be your own Scrum Master, it could be another team member, or it could be somebody from another team that steps in to help you out. And it's always good to encourage team members to run retros because then they're getting a bit more experience themselves in facilitating meetings. But it also gives a bit of a different perspective, so you're not having the same person running it retro after retro. So once you've got somebody that's allocated to facilitate that retro, make sure they plan something. Now, ideally, you'd have the Scrum Master that would do like the whole day before planning that retro, looking back at the sprint themselves to see, okay, what did we actually do in that sprint? Also seeing or identifying areas that we could improve and then actually having a format for that retro that will fit into that sprint because not all sprints are going to be the same. So once you've got that plan, when you've got the team coming together into the room for the retro, set the intention. So every time you get into that room for a retro, just remind them why you're there. So you're there to be able to learn and acknowledge how you went in that previous sprint. Now, it's also good to make sure that people are in the room. So firstly, all the team that are involved in that sprint are in the room, but also that they are actually present. So there might be a lot of stuff going on that's outside that they might be thinking about. And it's always good to just make sure that you can kind of focus them, make sure they have their phones turned off, that type of thing. But also to make sure that, you know, we've got this camaraderie, which is great, but it's also getting them to come back to focus and realise why we're there in that retro to get the most out of it. So you've got people in the room, we've set the intention. The next step is, well, you can either do this in two ways. So you can either have like an icebreaker, which not everyone's great about, like I'm just a bit like icebreakers, but it's a good way to actually build a bit more on the team and actually have a bit of a fun activity. Hopefully it's fun. And to just break the ice a bit and just get them settled into the room. Or another good thing you can do is to have a bit of a sprint review. So write up a timeline of the sprint and focus on, okay, well, what actually happened in that sprint? Like 2 weeks ago, who can remember what happened 2 weeks ago? Well, it's a matter of just going through and saying, okay, well, we had this goal or goals for the sprint. This happened on that Tuesday. And just going through a bit of a timeline just to see where the good points were, where the bad points were, and just to remind ourselves what actually happened in that sprint. So once you've gone through that, then it's time to actually facilitate the actual retro itself. So the usual format that people use, which is a great format to start with, is what went well, what didn't go so well, and what were you puzzled about? And there's different variations on that theme. And the idea is you can then, as individuals, indicate under those categories with hopefully post-its. And then what you can then do is actually vote on, okay, well, this topic seems pretty important because a lot of people put the same thing up. So when you've got people putting up their post-its, you can group them together in different categories or themes that you can see happening. And that makes it a lot easier to then see, okay, well, this is trending at the moment. Seems pretty important. Do we actually want to discuss this, or is this pretty clear? Everyone's clear on this, but they don't need to discuss it anymore. So it's up to the team to then vote on what they actually want to discuss in a bit more depth. Now, that's one format, but you can also use other formats as well, and there are a lot out there that you can use. And I've got a slide coming up soon that will show that as well. But it's a matter of making sure that everyone is actually participating. So the facilitator needs to make sure that everyone is having their chance to have their say, even if it's only the one post-it or one comment, at least they're having their say. So it's just trying to draw out a bit more information from people as well. So if there's a post-it that people have put up that you're not quite clear about, just ask the question, what was this about, that type of thing. So just trying to get a bit more information. And that will then help with also the voting and the discussion as well, because people can clarify what they meant by that particular comment or post-it. And while you're going through the process of the discussions, just as a facilitator, keep an ear out to see, okay, what could actually be an action from this discussion? It shouldn't just be a waffle fest. It should be a focused discussion so that you can actually come out with clear ideas of how you can go forward from there. And when you actually have an idea for an action item, ask the team, is this an action item? If it is, write it on the whiteboard. And also with actions, make sure that you allocate somebody to actually follow through with that action. Now, it may not be that they themselves need to do the action, but they can actually take responsibility to make sure that the team follows up on that action, so that it's not just, oh, we've got these actions, but no one's actually going to be looking at them because no one's actually allocated to them. And even if it's something for the team as a whole, it's always best to allocate at least one person to follow up to make sure that it happens. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the Scrum Master that does that either. So adding a bit of responsibility for the team members for that. So once you've got those actions, what do you do with them? So you've got somebody allocated, because sometimes you might come into the retro and you might have a bit of a review of the actions and realise, okay, well, nothing actually got done with that in the last sprint. Could be various reasons, but one of the main reasons would be no one was actually allocated to make sure that followed through. So it's always good to actually have a review of previous actions for sprints as well, because it might be something that's an ongoing issue. But yeah, most importantly, make sure that they are followed up on in some way. So these are these points. So yeah, make sure you've got a plan, set the intention and bring to focus on people. You can review the actions before you get into the actual discussions. Make sure the team can contribute, and make sure that the actionable, accountable actions are in place. Now, the next part of this talk is about a retro for every occasion. So, as I mentioned before, retros are not just for sprints or iterations. They can also be for pieces of work, points in time, and, you know, it's for every occasion, basically. I once had a retro for one of my teams where we were actually kind of disintegrating as a team. Things were going a bit pear-shaped, both with what we were producing, but also with some team changes. And so we decided to get together for a retro. It wasn't actually for a period of time as such. It was more just to analyse how we were working together. And one of the key points with this type of retro was we actually got somebody else in from outside the team to facilitate. Because if we had somebody within the team to facilitate, it wouldn't have been as effective. So if you're having some sort of conflict that you can't resolve within the team immediately, and that's why you're having this kind of retro, then bring in somebody that can facilitate and bring a different perspective in. And the way we ran that retro was with the 5 whys. So hands up if anyone's heard of the 5 whys before. Yeah. So this is a great technique, not only for retros, but also for getting down to customer specifications. Basically, you have a statement and you go and say, okay, well, why is this happening? And so you get to the next level and then you go, okay, great, why is this a problem? And you go through that 5 times. So this really gets to the bottom of issues or the bottom of needs, depending on how you're using it. And this was a really good way of kind of just eking out from us, what we saw was going wrong with the team. And a really good result of that retro was we actually changed the way we worked as far as some of the technology we were using. And we actually moved to something that was actually a bit more compatible for us and for the project we're working on. And it also got us closer as a team as well. So that's just one example of a retro that's not just sprint focused. Now, you can also use other formats of retros. I'll bring you to the next slide for this one. So one retro that I've discovered is really mouthy. It's high, low, goal, bane, crush, surprise. And this actually came originally from a juggling festival in New York. I came across it because I'm involved in some festivals outside of work, and somebody mentioned, oh, let's do this mouthy retro that doesn't even have a good acronym. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Retros for festivals. Okay. And the idea with this one is for each of these words, you come up with a post-it for yourself. So it's very individualised. And so this one is really good for releases or a project, so at the end of a project or release. So the high is like a highlight that you found for yourself during that period of time. Low, well, low light, so something that brought you down a bit. Goal. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be a team goal. It can actually be a personal goal, what you set out to actually accomplish for that period of time. Then we've got Bane. So Batman, Bane character. It's also the bane of your existence. So it's something that like really irked you and you didn't like at all. And then you've got crush. So this crush is in the sense of, oh, somebody did something really good and I felt like, oh, they're the most awesome person. So it's not the romantic crush, but it's close to it. It's like, yeah, it's pointing out somebody and saying, yep, good job, awesome. And then you've also got surprise. So surprise is something that you weren't expecting. So it could either be bad or good. And if you're running this type of retro and people come out with bad surprises, when you go through the surprises, point out the bad ones first and then go to the good ones, because you always want to finish off on a high note. So if you're looking at something that's really sad or bad, it's like, but if you, when you're going through the different aspects, if you focus on the surprise, that's good, it's often better. Now, this one I found works a bit better in smaller groups because it's so individual. A lot of information can come out from that. Another retro format, we went through the 5 I's, but we've also got the start, stop, more of, less of, and keep doing. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but yeah, it's going through each of those points and coming up with something that fit into those categories. The link there for the Trello board, that's actually a really good resource. And it actually has all these different types of retros with a bit of an explanation of how to run them. And that Trello board is actually available for anyone that has that link, basically. So it's a really good resource to have. And as I mentioned before, also building a retro kit. So if you go through in your organisation and just ask people, oh, what's your favourite retro and how do you run it? You can then build up a bit of a toolkit where you can actually write, like on index cards or something, just to write down that retro name and how you run it. And then if the situation arises where either the retro hasn't been planned properly, you can then pull out one of those cards and you can run the retro that way. It's also good to have that retro kit for those that facilitate retros, just so that they don't get bored with their own way of doing things as well, so they can mix things up a bit more. Okay, so recognising when retros go wrong, being able to try and rectify them in the situation, making sure for the future retros that you have a plan in place, that you've got somebody allocated to facilitate, and you've got a style of retro where you can make sure that everyone can be involved. That's the best way to run retros.